Then don't invest at all. The words were quiet, almost lost beneath the soft clink of crystal and the low hum of expensive conversations, but they landed with a precision that didn't belong to a waitress. Daniel Whitmore stopped mid-motion, his fork hovering just inches above a perfectly plated ribeye, the kind that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. A second ago, he had been laughing, openly, carelessly, his voice carrying across the table as he entertained his guests with what he considered a harmless joke. Financial advice, he had said, barely glancing up from his phone. Why not? Go ahead. Where should I put 10 million? The table had followed his lead, polite laughter rippling outward, because that was what people did around Daniel Whitmore. They laughed when he laughed. They agreed when he spoke. They never expected to be challenged, especially not by someone in a black and white uniform holding a water pitcher. Emily Carter had stood there the entire time, still, composed, her posture straight in a way that didn't quite match the role she played. She had seen men like him before. Men who measured intelligence by titles, by suits, by the weight of a watch on a wrist. Men who mistook silence for absence. She set the glass down gently beside him. No rush. No hesitation. Just that one sentence. And now, for the first time that evening, Daniel looked at her. Really looked. Not through her. Not past her. At her. The room didn't change, not visibly. The chandeliers still cast warm light across polished wood. The servers still moved in practiced rhythms. But something shifted at that table. Subtle. Almost invisible. The laughter didn't return. Daniel leaned back slightly, studying her with a focus that replaced amusement with something sharper. Curiosity. What did you just say? His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It always did. Emily met his gaze, calm, steady, as if she had all the time in the world. I said, she repeated, her tone even, you shouldn't invest at all. A faint smile touched someone at the table, unsure whether to laugh again. No one did. Because Daniel wasn't smiling anymore. He set his fork down slowly, the soft tap. Against porcelain louder than it should have been. That's a bold statement, he said, eyes narrowing just slightly. From someone who doesn't know the deal. Emily didn't react to the edge in his voice. Didn't step back. Didn't apologize. She simply adjusted the angle of the glass she had placed, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the table, as if details mattered more than tension. You're right, she said. I don't know the deal. A pause. Just enough to let him lean in. Just enough to let the room breathe again. But I know the pattern. That was when he sat up. Not dramatically. Not enough for anyone outside the table to notice. But enough. Enough to signal that something had changed. The man who had built a billion-dollar empire on control and prediction was now listening. And the waitress, who was never supposed to speak, had just taken the first move. Daniel Whitmore did not speak immediately. And that alone was enough to unsettle the table more than any sharp reply ever could, because silence from a man like him was rare, intentional, and expensive, the kind of silence that usually meant someone had just made a mistake. But this time no one could tell who it was, not yet, as his eyes remained fixed on Emily Carter, studying her the way he would study a balance sheet that did not quite add up, looking for the flaw, the inconsistency, the reason to dismiss what he had just heard. And yet there was none, not in her posture, not in her voice, not in the calm way she stood there as if she had not just interrupted a table of investors discussing numbers that could fund entire companies. The pattern, he repeated slowly, leaning forward now, elbows resting lightly on the table, his tone no longer amused, no longer dismissive, but measured, controlled. What pattern would that be? And for the first time that evening, no one reached for their glass. No one checked their phone. Even the quiet background music seemed to fade into something distant as Emily met his gaze without hesitation. Overconfidence, she said simply, and one of the men at the table let out a small breath that might have been a laugh if it had not died halfway, because she did not stop. There, you are entering late, paying a premium for something that already peaked 12 months ago, and trusting projections built on data that assumes stability in a market that has not been stable in over 3 years. Daniel's fingers tapped once against the table, a small, controlled movement, the kind he made when something caught his attention in a way he could not immediately explain. That is a strong assumption, he replied, his voice quieter now, sharper. And you are basing that on what exactly? Emily reached for the water pitcher again, not because anyone needed more water, but but because it gave her hands something to do, something grounded, something ordinary against the weight of what she was saying. Public filings, she answered. Quarterly reports, adjusted forecasts, and one detail that most people ignore. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Which is, and this time, there was no impatience in his voice, only focus, the kind reserved for negotiations that mattered. Their supply chain dependency, she said, placing the picture back down with careful precision, 70% tied to a region that has already shown signs of regulatory tightening. But the projections assume uninterrupted flow, which is not realistic. The man to Daniel's right shifted in his seat, suddenly uncomfortable, because that detail had been mentioned earlier in the meeting and dismissed just as quickly. That is speculation, someone else added, trying to regain control of the conversation, but Daniel raised a hand slightly, not looking away from Emily. No, he said quietly. That is not speculation. And the table fell silent again, because they all recognized that tone, the one he used when he realized something important, something he had missed. Tell me something. Daniel continued, sitting back now, but not breaking eye contact. If you know all this, why are you here? It was not a challenge this time, not a test, but a genuine question, and for a brief moment, something shifted in Emily's expression, not weakness, not hesitation, but something deeper, something that suggested a story she was not offering freely. Because knowing something, she said softly, and being listened to are not always the same thing. And that was when Daniel Whitmore stopped seeing a waitress and started seeing a variable he had not accounted for, one that did not fit into any model he had built. And for the first time in a long time, he did not have the advantage. The air at the table had changed in a way that could not be undone, and everyone felt it even if no one said it out loud, because power had shifted without permission, without announcement, and it now rested somewhere unexpected, somewhere no one had planned for. As Daniel Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair, not in dismissal, not in control, but in thought, real thought, the kind he reserved for decisions that carried weight beyond money. His fingers no longer tapping, his posture no longer casual, while across from him, Emily Carter stood exactly as she had before, composed, grounded, untouched by the tension she had created, as if this moment belonged to him to process, not to her to prove. You said the projections are wrong, Daniel continued, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. Then tell me what they missed. And this time there was no laughter waiting to follow, no one ready to turn it into a joke, because they all understood that this was no longer entertainment. This was evaluation, and Emily did not rush her answer, did not try to impress. She simply spoke. They assumed demand would hold, she said. But they ignored the shift in consumer behavior over the last 2 quarters. Daniel's eyes sharpened slightly. Explain. And she did, calmly, precisely, as if she had walked through this logic 100 times before. Spending has not decreased, but it has moved, she said, from expansion to efficiency, from risk to stability, and the companies that do not adjust for that are the ones that look strong on paper right before they fall. A subtle reaction moved across the table, not visible to anyone outside it, but clear to those sitting there, the kind of reaction that happens when someone recognizes truth before they are ready to admit it. Daniel's gaze did not leave her. And you believe this company is one of them? He asked, not as a challenge, but as confirmation, and Emily nodded once. I do, she said, because they are still telling the story they want investors to hear, not the reality the market is already showing. Silence followed, but it was no longer empty. It was full, heavy with recalculation, with quiet realization, with the slow understanding that something important had just been revealed in a place where no one expected it. Daniel reached for his phone, not out of habit this time, but with purpose, scrolling quickly, reviewing numbers he had already seen, data he thought he understood, and for a brief moment, something crossed his face, something rare, something almost imperceptible, doubt, not in her, but in his own certainty. He set the phone down again, slower this time, more carefully, as if placing something fragile. You are either very bold, he said, looking at her again, or very informed. And Emily did not smile, did not soften. She simply met his gaze with the same quiet steadiness. Those are not opposites, she replied, and one of the investors shifted again, uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the room. because what they were witnessing was not just a conversation. It was a redefinition of roles, a waitress speaking with the authority of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to gain, and a billionaire listening because, for the first time in a long time, he had found a voice that did not bend around him. Daniel exhaled slowly, not frustration, not irritation, but something closer to clarity, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed completely, stripped of performance, stripped of ego. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him, not as an order, but as an invitation, and for a brief second, the entire table waited, because what happened next would define everything that followed. But Emily did not move immediately. She glanced at the surrounding tables, at the quiet rhythm of the restaurant, at the life she was still standing inside, and then back at him, her voice soft, but certain. "I have other tables," she said. And just like that, the balance shifted again, because power was no longer about who could command the room, but who could choose when to step into it. Daniel Whitmore did not react immediately to her refusal, and that was what made it different, because a man like him was used to people adjusting their schedules, their priorities, even their principles for a single moment of his attention. Yet Emily Carter had not raised her voice, had not shown defiance. She had simply stated a fact, and in doing so, she had drawn a line that could not be negotiated. The kind of line that did not come from arrogance, but from clarity, and Daniel recognized it instantly, not as an insult, but as something far more rare, independence. His gaze followed her as she turned slightly, already shifting her focus back to the quiet rhythm of the restaurant, to another table where a couple waited with polite patience, as if the conversation they had just shared was not the most important thing in the room, as if she had not just altered the trajectory of a multi-million-dollar decision with a few measured sentences. And for a brief moment, Daniel felt something unfamiliar, not anger, not frustration, but interruption, the kind that forces a man to reconsider whether he is still in control of the moment. He exhaled slowly, then leaned forward again, his voice steady, stripped of performance. 5 minutes, he said, not louder, not sharper, just precise. That is all I am asking. And this time there was no command in it, only intent. Emily paused, not because she was pressured, but because she was choosing, her eyes briefly scanning the room. Again, calculating in a different way, not numbers, not risk, but responsibility. And then she looked back at him, studying him now the same way he had studied her, measuring not his wealth, not his status, but his willingness to listen, truly listen. The silence stretched just long enough to make the table aware that this was no longer about business. It was about something more subtle, respect, and finally, she gave a small nod, not agreement, not submission, but acknowledgement. She moved to the empty chair and sat down with quiet composure, placing her order pad neatly on the table as if it belonged there all along. And something shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Daniel did not smile, but there was a change in his eyes, a focus that replaced the last traces of earlier amusement. "Start from the beginning," he said, and this time, his phone remained untouched beside him, forgotten. Emily folded her hands lightly, not defensive, not nervous, simply present. "You are not wrong about the opportunity," she began, her voice calm, even. "But you are early in the wrong direction and late in the right one." One of the investors frowned slightly, confused, but Daniel did not interrupt. "Explain that," he said, and she did, walking him through the shift he had partially seen but not fully accepted, outlining how capital was moving quietly beneath the surface, how smaller firms were adapting faster while larger ones held on to outdated assumptions. Her words were not rushed, not dramatic. They were clear, deliberate, each sentence building on the last with the kind of precision that came from experience, not theory. And as she spoke, Daniel's expression changed again, not visibly to anyone who did not know him, but to those who did. It was unmistakable. This was how he looked when he realized he had underestimated something important. He leaned back slightly, absorbing it, processing, recalibrating, and when she finished, she did not add anything extra, did not try to impress. She simply stopped, allowing the silence to carry the weight of what she had said. Daniel nodded once, slowly, then glanced briefly at the others at the table, who now avoided his gaze, because they knew They all knew. The conversation had moved beyond them, and when he looked back at Emily, there was no trace of the earlier dismissal left, only recognition. "You have done this before," he said quietly, not a question, but a conclusion, and Emily held his gaze for a moment, then answered just as quietly, "Yes." And in that single word, there was more truth than any explanation could carry, enough to make Daniel Whitmore realize that the most valuable insight he had received that day had not come from a boardroom, but from someone he almost never would have noticed. Daniel Whitmore did not look away after her answer, and that single word lingered between them longer than any explanation could have, because it confirmed what he had already begun to suspect, that this was not luck, not instinct, but experience, the kind that could not be faked, the kind that left traces in the way someone spoke, in the way they paused, in the way they chose what not to say. He leaned back slowly, his hand brushing the edge of his glass but not lifting it, his attention fixed entirely on Emily Carter, as if the rest of the room had dimmed around her. "Where?" he asked, his voice low, controlled. "Did you learn to see things like that?" And it was not curiosity for the sake of conversation. It was the kind that came from recognizing value, from wanting to understand its origin. Emily did not answer immediately, not because she could not, but because she chose not to rush the moment, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. "In places where mistakes are expensive," she said finally, and there was no need to clarify what kind of expense she meant, because everyone at that table understood that some losses were measured far beyond dollars. Daniel nodded once, absorbing it, then reached for his phone again. But this time it was different, not distraction, not habit. He opened a document, scrolled, cross-checked, his eyes moving faster now, sharper, and with each second, the subtle tension in his jaw became more pronounced, not frustration, but recognition, the kind that came when pieces began to align in a way that could not be ignored. He set the phone down again, more firmly this time. "You said the supply chain exposure was underestimated," he said, looking directly at her. "If that collapses, what happens next?" And Emily answered without hesitation. "Liquidity tightens within 90 days, she said. Then they start cutting forward guidance to protect perception, which triggers institutional hesitation. And once that starts, recovery becomes much more expensive than prevention." One of the men at the table shifted uncomfortably again, because that timeline was not hypothetical, it was specific, too specific to dismiss. Daniel exhaled slowly, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind he gave when a decision was forming, not yet spoken, but already taking shape. "And where would you move instead?" he asked, and this time there was no trace of doubt in his voice, only intent to understand. Emily glanced briefly at the table, then back at him. "Energy transition infrastructure," she said, "but not where everyone is looking." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in skepticism, but in focus. "Be specific," he said, and she was outlining a sector that had not yet reached peak attention, explaining how regulatory incentives were quietly shifting capital flows, how mid-sized operators were positioned to scale faster than the large names dominating headlines. Her words were measured, grounded, not exaggerated, and that was what made them powerful, because they did not try to impress, they simply revealed. And as she spoke, something changed at the table once more, not in her, but in him. Daniel Whitmore was no longer evaluating her. He was following her reasoning, step by step, as if recalibrating his own. And when she finished, he did not respond immediately. He sat there for a moment, still, thinking, the kind of thinking that reshapes outcomes. Then finally, he leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter than before, but carrying more weight than anything he had said that evening. "You realize," he said, "that everything you just described contradicts the deal I am about to sign." And Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, unchanged. "Yes," she said softly, and there was no challenge in it, no triumph, only truth. And that was what made it impossible to ignore, because for the first time that evening, the decision in front of Daniel Whitmore was no longer about profit. It was about whether he would listen to the one voice that had nothing to gain from being right. Daniel Whitmore held her gaze a second longer than necessary, as if weighing not just her words, but the absence of anything behind them that suggested doubt. And that was what unsettled him most, not confidence, but certainty, the kind that did not need to prove itself, the kind that simply existed. And for a man who had built his entire life on calculated certainty, it was both familiar and deeply uncomfortable. His fingers slowly interlocked on the table, a subtle shift from the earlier restless movement, as if he was grounding himself before making a decision that could not be undone. The room around them continued to move, waiters passing, glasses clinking, conversations flowing, but at that table, time had slowed into something deliberate, something focused. "Do you understand?" he said finally, his voice steady but lower now. "That walking away from this deal costs me more than money." Emily did not look surprised, did not react as if this was new information. She had already considered it, already measured it. "Yes," she said. "It costs you momentum, credibility with the people who expect you to follow through, and the illusion that you already decided correctly." There was no accusation in her tone, only clarity, and Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because she had not just described the deal, she had described him, the weight of expectation, the pressure to remain consistent, the silent rule that success must always look intentional, even when it was not. He exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before returning to her. "And yet you still think I should walk away?" he said. And it was not disbelief. It was a final check, a last attempt to see if she would soften, if she would step back, if she would give him an easier answer. But Emily did not move, did not adjust. She simply met his question with the same quiet steadiness. "I think," she said, "you already know the answer, and you are asking me to make it easier to accept." The words landed without force, but they settled deeper than anything else she had said, because they removed the distance between analysis and decision, between logic and responsibility. And for a moment, Daniel Whitmore said nothing at all, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood exactly what she meant, the kind of understanding that does not come with relief, only with clarity. His hand moved toward his phone again, but this time he did not scroll, did not check numbers. He simply looked at the screen, at the open document, at the deal that had seemed inevitable just minutes ago. And then he locked it, placing the phone face down on the table, a small action, almost invisible, but final in a way that did not need to be announced. One of the investors shifted immediately, sensing the change before it was spoken. "Daniel," the man began carefully, "we should at least review the terms again before making any adjustments." But Daniel did not look at him. His attention remained on Emily, as if the rest of the conversation no longer held relevance. "No," he said quietly, and the single word carried more authority than anything louder could have. The table fell silent again, because they all understood what that meant. Not hesitation, not delay, but decision. Daniel leaned back slightly, the tension in his posture easing, not because the situation had become easier, but because it had become clear. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed, stripped of the last trace of resistance. "If you are right," he said, "then this is not a missed opportunity." A brief pause, just enough to let the thought settle. "It is a mistake avoided." Emily gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the conclusion he had reached himself. And that was the difference. She had not convinced him. She had not pushed him. She had simply shown him what was already there, and allowed him to see it. The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was resolved, and for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore did not feel like the most certain person at the table, but he did feel something else, something far more rare, aligned. No one spoke after that, not immediately, because the kind of decision Daniel Whitmore had just made did not invite quick reactions. It demanded recalibration, and the men at the table, all experienced in their own right, all accustomed to navigating high-stakes conversations, suddenly found themselves outside the center of one, watching it unfold instead of shaping it. One of them cleared his throat softly, shifting in his chair. "We should revisit the projections," he offered, but the words felt thinner now, less certain, as if even he no longer believed in them the same way. Daniel did not respond, not because he dismissed the suggestion, but because he had already moved past it, his attention returning, once again, to Emily Carter, who had not changed her posture, had not leaned forward, had not claimed the moment in any visible way. She simply sat there, composed, as if the outcome of a multi-million-dollar decision was not something she needed to hold on to, and that, more than anything, made it clear that her value did not depend on whether she was acknowledged. "What would you do?" Daniel asked after a moment. And this time the question was different, not analytical, not hypothetical, but personal, direct. "If you were in my position," Emily's eyes softened just slightly, not emotionally, but thoughtfully, as if she was considering not just the numbers, but the weight behind them. "I would wait," she said, and the answer, simple as it was, landed with more force than anything complex could have. "Wait," Daniel repeated, as if testing the word itself. "For what?" And she answered without hesitation. "For the moment when the market stops telling stories and starts showing consequences." A quiet stillness settled again, not heavy this time, but clear, the kind that comes when a path forward is no longer hidden, just difficult to choose. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing it, then turned slightly toward the others at the table, his gaze sweeping across them. Not confrontational, not defensive, but resolved. "We are not proceeding," he said, and there was no need to raise his voice, because certainty did not require volume. One of the investors opened his mouth as if to respond, then stopped, recognizing that the decision had already been made, not impulsively, but deliberately, and that was what mattered most. Daniel turned back to Emily, his expression no longer guarded, no longer analytical, but something closer to genuine respect. "You just changed the direction of a deal that has been in motion for 6 months, he said. Not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact, and Emily gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "No," she replied softly. "You did." And the distinction mattered, because it placed the decision exactly where it belonged, not on the voice that revealed the truth, but on the one who chose to act on it. Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer, then allowed a faint, thoughtful smile to appear, not the confident, performative smile he wore in meetings, but something quieter, more real. "Most people," he said, "would have told me what I wanted to hear." Emily stood slowly from her seat, her movement unhurried, natural, as if returning to where she belonged, not above the table, not within it, but beyond the need for either. "Most people," she said, "need something from you." And with that, she picked up her order pad, the simple object grounding her once again in the role everyone had assumed defined her. Yet now it was clear that it did not. Daniel watched her for a second as she turned to leave, then spoke once more, not loudly, but enough for her to hear. "Emily," he said, and she paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Yes, what do you need?" he asked, and for the first time since the conversation began, there was no calculation behind the question, no negotiation, just sincerity. And Emily met his gaze one last time, her expression calm, steady, unchanged. "Nothing," she said, and then she walked away, leaving behind a table full of men who had just witnessed something they could not quite explain, but would not forget. Emily Carter did not look back again after that, and within seconds she had blended back into the rhythm of the restaurant, moving between tables with the same quiet efficiency she had carried all evening, refilling glasses, taking orders, offering small nods and polite smiles, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened, as if she had not just redirected the decision of a man whose choices shaped entire markets. And that was what stayed with Daniel Whitmore long after she disappeared into the flow of service, not just what she said, but how easily she let it go, as if influence was not something she needed to hold on to. He remained seated for a moment, his hand resting near his untouched glass, his eyes following her movement across the room, not out of distraction, but out of recognition, because he had spent years surrounding himself with voices that competed for his attention, voices that pushed, persuaded, negotiated, and yet the one voice that had cut through all of that had asked for nothing in return. "Daniel," one of the investors said carefully, pulling him back into the moment. "We should discuss next steps." But Daniel did not respond immediately, his attention shifting back to the table slowly, as if recalibrating to a conversation that no longer held the same urgency. "Next steps are simple," he said finally, his tone calm, settled. "We wait." The word landed with quiet authority, and no one challenged it this time, not because they fully agreed, but because they understood that the decision had already moved beyond debate. Daniel reached for his phone again, not to reopen the deal, but to send a short message, precise, direct, the kind that closed doors rather than opened them. And once it was sent, he placed the phone back down without hesitation, as if releasing something he had been holding longer than he realized. The tension at the table eased, not completely, but enough to signal that the direction had been set. Conversation resumed, softer now, less certain, as the others adjusted to a plan they had not expected, but Daniel was no longer fully present in it. Part of his attention remained elsewhere, anchored to a thought that had not yet resolved. After a few minutes, he stood, not abruptly, not to interrupt, but with quiet intention. "I will step away for a moment," he said, and no one questioned it, because men like him did not need to explain their movements. He walked across the restaurant with measured steps, not hurried, not hesitant, his gaze scanning until it found her again near the far side of the room, speaking softly to another table, her expression attentive, composed, unchanged. He waited, not calling out, not interrupting, simply standing a few feet away until she finished, and when she turned, she noticed him immediately, not surprised, just aware. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice calm, professional, the same tone she used with every guest, as if their earlier conversation had not altered anything between them. And Daniel realized in that moment that for her, it had not in the way it had for him. "Yes," he said, then paused briefly, choosing his words more carefully than he was used to. "I wanted to ask you something." Emily nodded slightly, giving him her attention without shifting her stance, without leaning in, without offering more than what was necessary. And that balance, that quiet control, was something Daniel recognized now as deliberate. "Earlier," he continued, "you said you learned in places where mistakes are expensive." A small pause, just enough to signal that the question mattered. "What happened?" he asked, and for the first time since they had spoken, there was a subtle change in Emily's expression, not hesitation, not discomfort, but distance, the kind that comes from memory rather than uncertainty. She held his gaze for a moment, then answered simply, "I stayed somewhere I should not have." And the words were quiet, but they carried weight, the kind that did not need detail to be understood. Daniel did not press further, not because he was not curious, but because he understood that some answers were complete without explanation. He nodded once, slowly, then said, "And now?" Another small pause. "You choose where to stay." Emily gave a faint, almost unnoticeable smile, not in amusement, but in acknowledgement. "Now," she said, "I choose when to leave." And with that, she picked up a tray from the counter beside her, her movement smooth, unhurried, as she returned to her work, leaving Daniel Whitmore standing there for a moment longer, not searching for more, but understanding that sometimes the most valuable insight was not in what someone revealed, but in what they had already walked away from. Daniel Whitmore stood there a moment longer after she walked away, not because he expected her to turn back, but because something in him had not yet caught up with what had just happened, the kind of delay that comes when a realization arrives quietly instead of all at once. He exhaled slowly, then returned to his table, the familiar weight of conversation waiting for him, but it no longer felt the same. The voices, the numbers, the strategies, they all continued, but they carried less urgency now, less certainty, as if the foundation beneath them had shifted just enough to be noticed. One of the investors leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly. "We can pivot into a secondary position," he suggested, trying to regain structure, but Daniel simply shook his head once, not dismissive, not abrupt, just clear. "Not yet," he said, and the conversation adjusted again, orbiting around a decision that had already been made. Minutes passed, then more, the rhythm of the evening returning on the surface, but beneath it, something had changed permanently, and when the check arrived, Daniel glanced at it briefly before reaching for his card, not out of habit, but with intention. He signed without hesitation, then paused, his pen hovering for just a second longer than necessary, before he wrote something beneath his name, not a number, not a gesture meant to impress, but a single line, simple, deliberate. He closed the folder and handed it back without comment, as if it was no different from any other transaction. Across the room, Emily continued her work, unaware of the exact moment the decision was sealed in ink rather than words. When she eventually returned to collect the folder, she opened it with the same professional calm she had carried all evening, her eyes moving briefly over the receipt, then stopping, just for a fraction of a second, on the line beneath the signature. No visible reaction followed, no shift in posture, no change in expression, but something registered, something quiet, something understood. She closed the folder again and moved on. The night continued, tables turned, lights dimmed slightly as the late hour approached, and one by one, the guests left, until the restaurant settled into the soft stillness that comes at the end of a long shift. Daniel was one of the last to leave, not because he had stayed for anything specific, but because he had not felt the need to rush away. As he stepped outside, the cool air met him with a clarity that matched his thoughts. The city still moved around him, cars passing, distant voices blending into the background. But he stood there for a moment, still, grounded in a decision that had not been driven by pressure or expectation, but by something far more rare, alignment. He glanced down briefly at his watch, then back toward the restaurant window, where the reflection of the inside world shimmered faintly against the glass. He did not go back in, did not call out, did not try to extend the moment beyond what it had already been, because he understood something now that he had not before, that not every valuable connection was meant to be continued. Some were meant to be recognized, respected, and left exactly where they were found, inside. Emily finished resetting a table, aligning the glasses with quiet precision, the same way she had earlier, the same attention to detail, the same calm presence. Nothing about her movements suggested that anything had changed, and perhaps that was the point, because the world did not always announce its turning points. Sometimes they happened in small conversations, in quiet corrections, in moments where one person chose to listen and another chose to speak without needing anything in return. And as Daniel Whitmore walked away into the night, he carried with him something that could not be measured in numbers or negotiated in meetings, a standard, raised without force, without demand, simply by being seen. And somewhere behind him, in a restaurant that would look exactly the same tomorrow, a waitress continued her work, unchanged, except for one thing: she no longer needed to prove what had already been true all along, and neither did he.